without further ado, I'm passing the mic to Sadie Andas, who will be the first slide, starting our second session.
Thank you, Anna, and good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to the session. And happy to be here with you, and thank you for the invitation, especially for Iris. It's cool the summer. You're there. You are there. So this paper examines the boundaries of acceptable and reprehensible use of force in the sources of the First Crusade, and I will focus on the concept of cruelty here. It's based on one of the central themes of my forthcoming book on Crusader violence, Extinction by Death. It should be out, well, I hope in early 24. I don't know. I've received the decision, but not the timetable yet. So this is exciting time for me. Then the basic structure, I will begin with definitions and continue with the concept of acceptable and unacceptable use of force. Then I discuss some cases in which the First Crusaders were accused of cruelty and greed. And those are, of course, not many, so there are exceptions of the rule we will be concentrating on today. In modern usage, violence arouses negative connotations typically related to brutality, cruelty, and savagery. Intentional acts of violence are almost invariably regarded as objectionable and often punishable by law. Unprovoked violent behavior indicates unrestrained aggression, mental imbalance, sickness, or pathologic carelessness. In other words, violence is interpreted in terms of social or medical dysfunctioning or both, which requires prevention and control by legal sanction or medical treatment. In modern states, the exercise of possible measures implies public authorization based upon the law. When the use of force is conceived as positively justified, it is often not designated by the term violence at all. The 12th and early 13th century sources of the Crusades broadly define violence as deeds that are physically destructive or otherwise considered as harmful, and that take place in communication between one or more assailants and their target. In the Gesta Francorum, the vocabulary indicating violence is almost invariably connected with physical damage or deprivation. The chronicler reports various incidents using the terms crudelitas or violentia, mostly for the human infliction of physical harm with weapons or hands. Harmful factors such as hunger, disease, bad weather, and fire emerge in the text, but they are typically not spoken in the same terms. The medieval Christian outlook on violence is somewhat different from that of today. The decisive element in justifying the use of force, more than the act as such, and besides its legality and convergence with social norms, was the moral impetus, whether the act was sinfully intended or not. The cases concerning despicable aggression in the chronicles of the First Crusade mostly fall into two categories: deeds defined as cruelty, mostly indicating indiscriminate slaughter and persecution of Christians, or plundering and theft. The basic causes connected with these cases are hatred in the case of Muslims and greed in the case of Crusaders. The theologians of the Crusades laid great stress on right intention motivated by piety, charity, and love of Christ and fellow Christians, excluding the love of one's enemy. In the absence of these motivations, not only individual battles, the whole pilgrimage would inevitably result in failure. For Crusader chroniclers and poets, the outcome of an action was depicted more as a consequence of the mental attitudes and motivations of those performing it than the physical circumstances in which they performed it. In general, the sources perceive positively self-defense, protecting a member of family, relative, liege lord, or an ally, or punishment of crime or deliberate violation of shared norms. In all these incidents, the cause of action is explained as a just and necessary means to correct a breach of law, whether divine or secular. The former case typically concerns accusations of heresy, paganism, and blasphemy, and the latter illegal attack on life and limb, or seizure of inheritance, possession, or right. Importantly, both canon and lay law codes from 11th and 12th century Europe, as well as the specific rules of the Crusaders' units surviving from the Second Crusade onward, limit their regulations to protect Christians or at the most citizens of Christian kingdoms. On crusade, attacking the enemies of the church was not a crime and not a sin either if motivated by loyalty and charity. In such cases, neither legal punishment nor penance was needed. To quote Ivo Schad, fighting the heathen in areas inhabited by them to defend Christians was praiseworthy, but to mistake Christian captives for barbarians and kill them was a sin that necessitated 40 days penance at the discretion of the bishop. To kill a Saracen, heretic, or pagan out of cupidity or hatred was wicked and required penance, even if performed on crusade, but not a crime in the legal sense. The underlying idea was that whereas the legal punishment avenged the wrong done to the victim, penance purified the soul of the sinner. In other words, legal judgment was intended to assist the victim of crime, whereas penance enabled the salvation of the perpetrator. When the first Crusaders, for instance, were reported as digging up Muslim cadavers from their graves to rob or even consume them in Marat and Liman, no legal proceedings were mentioned as having been brought against those involved, although their behavior was deplored. Even if it was strictly forbidden to sell another Christian in slavery, trading in Muslims or pagans was practiced by Crusaders both in the Levant and in the Baltic region. So, unacceptable cases. When violent acts were aroused against fellow Crusaders, they were seen as caused by moral vices, avarice, pride, envy, luxury, and rapina. That is another subspecies of avarice, which in the early Crusader chronicles indicates the plunder of Christian communities, as well as sexual offenses, including a welter of violations from extramarital partnership to rape. The Latin term violentia can be translated as vehemence, impetuosity, or ferocity. According to the medieval idea of the 7 or 8 mortal sins, avarice and pride constituted the 2 root sins, from which all the rest stemmed. Since violence, violentia, was usually subordinated to avarice, the crimes caused by it were typically seen as a consequence of a sinful wish to gain material profit, seize the property or right belonging to someone else, or ruin legal possession. Such injurious aims led to homicide, plundering, violent robbery, arson, and also rape. The essential interdependence of a material component and the act of violentia makes the use of the Latin term in the sources narrower than that of its modern English derivative, also French, violence, although both terms usually indicate illegal use of force. Because of the limited meaning of the Latin phrase violentia, the authors, when referring to what we understand as violence, often define the incident in terms of cruelty, crudelitas, in the meaning of gravely illegal, disturbing, or disproportionate uses of violence. In the Gesta Norma Norum Ducum, in the part written by William Jumièges from around 1070 onward, text until 1185, for instance, a premeditated murder of a knight, either secretive and nocturnal or carried out by poison, was claimed as cruelty. Vengeance for such a crime was considered just. In medieval discussions of the atrocities of war, cruelty is typically connected with indiscriminate killing, savage or ignominious mistreatment of fellow Christians, physical violation of clerics, and the destruction of church property. This is also the case with the Chronicles of the First Crusade. Saracens are acting out of cruelty when they are depicted killing a priest on the altar while performing the mass, gouging eyes out of statues of saints, fixing the decapitated heads of Christians on stakes, piercing the stomachs of Christians, raping mothers present of their children, etc., etc. As a rule, crusaders or other Christians are victims of Saracen cruelty, whereas crusader offensives against Muslim armies or settlements, with few exceptions, remain free from such accusations. In the fictional story of Le Chatil, written down around 1180 or a bit earlier, the Saracen Corvahan is even depicted in possession of the original sword of Herod used for the massacre of innocents, to point out both his tainted lineage as well as his inherited cruelty towards the defenseless. When Urban II was reported to blame the barons for having their hands stained with murderous blood, he referred to inter-Christian violence. Criticism of princes occurs in the sources when the crusaders are mistreated or their rights forfeited, whereas protests raised for foul play with the adversaries is exceptional and rare. When Bohemond, for instance, was reported to have deceived the Turkish leaders with their families in Maratanuman, first promising to save their lives, then having some killed and others sold to slavery, the anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum repeats the events as a matter of fact. No criticism. The source of cruelty in the sources is mostly human beings. In isolated cases, also weather, circumstantial deprivation, such as hunger or thirst, or wild animal can be labeled as cruel. Albert Ahen mentions pilgrim seized by hungry bear. Duke Godfrey came to his aid, attacked the cruel beast, and is mentioned as cruel beast, with his sword and sought to pierce its liver. The bear escaped the blow, and its claws, caught in the duke's tunic, pulled him from the saddle. Godfrey tried to defend himself, but instead of killing the bear, cut his own leg with his sword. He was narrowly saved by a certain Elisha. Medieval Western authors connected unselective methodical killing of fellow Christians with lack of civilization and Christian morals. Political opponents and rivals were effectively vilified by showing them slaying women, children, and the elderly after the habit of bloodthirsty pagans. Roger Howden tells us how the kings of Scotland's army, campaigning in Northumbria in 1138, slit open pregnant women, fixed their embryos on their spearheads, and beheaded priests on their altars. So these are the same topoi coming over and over in different myths within European lore, probably also in other laws. According to William of Newburgh, the Scots cut the throats of old men, killed little children, tore out the entrails of women, and committed other crimes too horrible to mention. I think actually you probably remember better than I do, but isn't it so that in Robert the Monk's version of Urban II speech in Thurman, he's also referring to the same topos, crimes too horrible to mention, to Saracens, yes. And of course, the other chronicles and Chanson of the First Crusade also contain similar topoi. Albert Ahen laments the fate of the People's Crusade in 1096. The weak and crippled, clerics, monks, aged women, suckling babies and infants were all put to the sword regardless of age by Saracens near Civitot. The Chanson d'Antioch, surviving from around 1180, concludes the account of the Saracen attack on the Crusader camp during the first siege of Antioch with a reference to howling babies who tried to suckle the corpses of their mothers, also to be found in several other stories. The case of non-Christian adversaries was different. Chronicles depict crusaders in the frenzy of battle, killing indiscriminately during the conquests of Antioch and Jerusalem. During the capture of Jerusalem in particular, crusaders are mentioned to have spared no one, wading ankle deep, knee deep, up to their stirrups, depending on the version, in Saracen blood in the Temple of Solomon. Phrases like all and no one emphasize the large number of casualties, not necessarily total destruction in the strict sense of the word. After the carnage in Jerusalem was over, countrymen of Toulouse allowed safe conduct against ransom for the emir who had surrendered Tower of David to him, as well as the Turks, Arabs, and Ethiopians who had sought refuge there. Young Saracens, males and females, were kept alive to serve the Crusaders. Day after, the captives were ordered to clean the city from the corpses and wash the buildings. While gathering the severed body parts, dragging the corpses out of the city, the enslaved prisoners were told to have wept bitterly. This is not to say that medieval warfare was not cruel or that the writers told stories all the time, but to point out that the inclusion of random slaughter made a statement, whether or not the given facts were accurate. Even if the description was given in a straightforward manner, the reference had the connotation of crude rage. If connected to the party the author was writing for, such fragments might hint at several collateral meanings and not always excluding hidden criticism. The reconstruction of events was not unproblematic even for the eyewitnesses, let alone for secondary sources. Guibert Nogent complains that it was impossible for anyone to tell what really happened at the siege of Antioch, since no one would have been able to participate in all the crucial events, and Guibert himself, of course, had not been present at all. The problem is common and gives one explanation for the often rather formulaic depictions of battles in which attack, counterattack, slaying of the enemy, and taking booty form a chronological entity, and a few prosaic details concerning actual fighting help the audience to comprehend the order of events. In the sources, the emergence of piously inspired acts of violence correlates closely with the highlights of the crusade, the conquests of the major cities and the restoration of the whole city to Christian rule. The generally monotonous and brief accounts of fighting in the chronicles from preparations to aftermath go through a considerable change during the sieges and battles of Antioch. The events in and around Antioch represent the turning point of the First Crusade and were therefore described in great detail. To quote Caroline Smith, this reflects the actual length of the siege at Antioch and the more harrowing tribulations of the army there. And it is interesting to note that the heavy focus on Antioch in the letter signed in Latakia by the leaders in 1099 is reflected in the later, longer narratives of the crusade. Quote ends. After the capture of the city, descriptions of assaults involving bloodshed become longer, more frequent, and more detailed, culminating in the fall of Jerusalem. The preceding moderation of verbal expression is completely abandoned by the authors of the Chronicles. There are two clear cases in which the Chronicles of the First Crusade unanimously condemn the Crusaders' activities against non-Christians because of cruelty. The attacks against the Jews within the Western kingdoms and the cannibalism and related violation of Muslim graves in Antioch and Barat Nuba. In addition, Albert of Aachen, who was not present, called Crusader actions cruel in his account of the events in Jerusalem. His version of the conquest of Antioch, while otherwise conventional, also includes a reference to Christian victims. Here, according to Albert, Crusaders killed ferociously during the capture of Antioch, putting the sword inhabitants in the streets and sparing no one on grounds of their age or gender. Greek, Syrian, and Armenian Christians were among the victims. They may not have been the intended targets, but the slaughter took place in the early morning when it was still dark. While raiding a Saracen camp nearby, women, young children, and suckling infants were slain by the Crusaders and trampled by the horses. And now we get to this example. This account of the Crusaders storming Jerusalem in 1099 mentions women being pierced while trying to escape their scourges, sucking babies that were seized from their mothers' laps, or their cradles, grasped by the soles of their feet, flung against the walls to break their necks. The account is reminiscent of the biblical description of the holy innocents who were snatched away from their mothers by the soldiers of Herod and killed instantly in front of the grieving women. The story was not only very popular, but to Albert and his contemporaries, Herod's resentment towards baby Jesus, leading to the massacre in Bethlehem, symbolized hatred and envy, and the king of Judea himself, the embodiment of cruelty. On the third day after the conquest, the slaughter continued, I quote. Everyone seized weapons and searched for a wretched massacre of all the crowd of Gentiles, which still was left, bringing some out from fetters, beheading them, slaughtering others who were found throughout the city streets and districts, whom they had previously spared for the sake of money or human pity. They were beheading or striking down with stones girls, women, noble ladies, even pregnant women, and very young children, paying attention to no one's age. By contrast, women, ladies, tormented by fear of imminent death and horror-struck by the violent slaughter, were embracing Christians among their midst, even as they were raving and venting their rage on the throats of both sexes in the hope of saving their lives. Some were wounded about the Christians' feet, begging them with piteous weeping and wailing for their lives and safety. When children of 5 or 3 years old saw the cruel fate of their mothers and fathers, of one accord they intensified the weeping and raised clamor. But they were making these signals for pity and mercy in vain. For the Christians gave over their whole hearts to the slaughter, so that not a suckling little male child or female, not even an infant of 1 year would escape alive the hand of the murderer, quote ends. Albert states both that the Crusaders were cruelly butchering the Saracens while capturing and looting the city, and that the fate of the slaughtered parents of the little children was cruel. He adds that while the commoners were massacring the Saracens, Duke Godfrey, Albert's protagonist, soon withdrew from the slaughter, took off his hauberk and shoes, and processed humbly to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where he prayed and gave thanks to the Lord. The aim of the pilgrimage was thus reached, and Godfrey's loyal Chamberlain's Stabile's vision of him entering the heaven together with the Duke, which was seen already before they left home, was fulfilled there. Albert does not directly criticize the Crusaders' ferocity, but he is careful to dissociate Godfrey and his closest servants from the slaughter carried out by the mob and underline their pious motives, initiated by an omen sent by God himself. While the Crusaders kill and loot, Godfrey and his associates worship. The reference to Sabella's vision underlies the sincerity of the Duke and his party, who had set out from the beginning with the intention of praising the Savior by his grave and remained steadfast in their goal until they reached it. Now, Albert wasn't there. He couldn't know what had happened. He hadn't seen anything. He was maybe interviewing returning Crusaders. And it's interesting that he adds such a long story of Crusaders cruelly attacking children, and is also using a very peculiar terminology. Because this choice of words while describing the fate of the infants at the hands of the Crusaders is notable. In classical Latin, the word percussor means a murderer or bandit, a criminal. Percussio, it can be a cloud on the head. In medieval Latin, the latter term could mean calamity, also punishment or chastisement. Where the wailing infants should normally arouse compassion and benevolence, here it does not. The children's cries for piety and mercy, pietatis et misericordiae, were futile. In other words, Crusaders' action was not virtuously intended. The essential elements of infanticide are present in the text. Albert does not blame the Crusaders for the crime, but he abstains from the expressions of approval or references to divine favors that he frequently directs to the Crusaders' military operations elsewhere in his chronicle. Although his usage of terminology concerning indecorous violence is not completely consistent throughout his chronicle, he obviously disapproves here of the killing of small children as impious. Other chronicles similarly mention indiscriminate slaughter during the conquest of Jerusalem, but either keep to neutral terminology or praise the Crusaders for their wholehearted effort to avenge the enemies of God. Even Godfrey of Bouillon, whom Albert usually praises as the epitome of a Christian knight, is reprimanded for cruelty in another context. In this case, the accusation is implicit, conveyed by the Saracen adversaries, who criticize Godfrey for being impious and cruel, for not ransoming his fellow crusader, Gerard of Aves, who was being kept hostage by the citizens of Arsuf. The chancellor of the Holy Sepulchre and future patriarch repeats the rebuke by claiming that Godfrey is perfidious and callous, perfidia et furitia cordis, if he does not help his brothers Gerard and Lambert. Gerard lost his life after having appeared to the Duke to bestow his horse and arms to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for the cure of his soul, but later Godfrey attacked the citizens of Arsuf when they were working in their fields and vineyards outside the city, killing, according to Albert, who still had not been there, over 500 and cutting their noses, hands, and feet off. Their wives and children were taken as prisoners to Jerusalem. Albert does not mention whether Godfrey was motivated by vengeance, among other things, but he maintains the sinfulness of not helping a brother. In general, perhaps with the exception of Albert and Raymond of Aguilar, who openly celebrates the physical suffering of the enemy, the chronicles do not reveal any particular emotional response in their descriptions of the practice of violence. Typically, the sources either accept violent treatment of non-Christians as a reality of warfare or eulogize the heroic bloodshed on the battlefield in the style of epic poetry. The cases in which the source of violence is analyzed remain exceptional. Then, in case of avarice, the acts of cruelty described in the sources were abhorrent events which in our times could often be called crimes against humanity. They were mostly carried out by the enemy or the rabble, whereas noble crusaders were called cruel only in very exceptional cases, such as already mentioned Godfrey for neglecting to ransom his knights, or Emika of Leiningen for attacking the Jewish subjects of a Christian ruler. By contrast, greed was a vice of great and small alike, causing much discord among the leadership. Albert of Aachen accuses Count Raymond of Toulouse of his desire for gold and silver, Bohemond of Taranto of his voracious avarice, and Baldwin of Boulogne of being envious of another lord's material gain. Raymond of Aguilar describes ambitious lords leaving their beds at midnight, set their standards in conspicuous places before others, as well as the genuine hatred between Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond that flared up with a dispute over the rule of Antioch. The situation had not altered much by 1111, when the Damascus Chronicle refers to mutual hostility of Western lords against each other. Albert includes in his chronicle a lengthy description of series of conflicts that began in Tarsus, where two crusader hosts nearly attacked each other. After the capture of Antioch, Tancred had left the main force and was scouting the coastal area. He blundered the region around Tarsus and managed by promises and threats to negotiate surrender of the city. At this point, Baldwin of Boulogne, Duke Godfrey's brother, emerged with a larger force. The two armies, mistaking each other as Turks, came close to battle. Initially, the tense situation was diffused with mutual relief and without hostilities breaking out between the crusaders. Baldwin, however, came to resent Tancred's good fortune. Filled with indignation and anger, he provoked a bitter argument with Tancred and pressurized the townspeople until they agreed to throw Tancred's standard down from the walls and replace it with that of Baldwin's. Tancred, whose host was smaller in number, decided to retreat and continue the march to Adana, held by a fellow crusader, and then to Mamistra, which he captured. After Tancred had left Tarsus, Baldwin and his men entered the city, where they were seated 2 towers. Soon after, 300 of Bohemond's men, who had left Antioch to join Tancred, emerged in front of the city walls. Baldwin did not let them pass through the gates, with the consequence that Turkish inhabitants of Tarsus sneaked out of the city overnight and killed and decapitated the Normans to the last man. The Turks were blamed for perfidy, injustice, and cruelty, but the Catholic people in the city, which can only mean Balduin's men, had also other reason to be agitated. They seized weapons, calling Baldwin guilty for the massacre, and cried out for vengeance. Baldwin was compelled to take refuge in one of the towers and assure everyone in public that he had had no part in the slaughter. His excuse was that he had given his word to the Turks and Armenians that he would admit only his own men to the city until his brother, the Duke, would arrive with additional forces. To appease his men, nearly 200 Turks remaining in the city were beheaded. Both the explanation and the reason for vengeance on the Turks were flimsy. In reality, the story is real, that is. Baldwin had deceived his fellow pilgrims and comrades in arms, as well as a newly won ally with whom he had made a pact of peace. Further justification for the acts was clearly needed and duly added by Albert of Aachen. The death of Bohemond's men could not be given a truly acceptable justification, but the betrayal of the Turks was excused by adding a reference to a great number of women of the town who showed the Crusaders their noses and ears, which had been cut off after they had refused to be defiled by the Turks. Apparently, maimed parts had been conserved for later use and were now conveniently at hand. Next, Baldwin followed Tancred to Mamistra. Richard of Salerno, Tancred's relative, bearing a grudge because of the incidents in Tarsus, accused Baldwin of injustice and envy and urged Tancred to display some manly courage and return the insult. Hearing his words, Tancred could not bear to lose his honor and charged with his cavalry in the camp of Baldwin. This time, blood was shed and lives lost, including Richard and other noblemen of both sides. An armed conflict between crusaders clearly exceeded the limits of acceptable use of force. It contravened the treaties of alliance between the leaders, involved indiscriminating acts related to involuntary manslaughter, perfidy, and plunder, and endangered the outcome of the whole expedition. Tancred and Baldwin admitted to having gone too far. On the next morning, both men acknowledged their sins against God and violation of the sacred way of Jerusalem. Peace was made and sealed with an exchange of hostages, prisoners of war, and booty, after which Baldwin left with his men to Armenia to avoid further problems. The incident is notable because, as already noted, Baldwin's army was greater in number. The decision that he should retreat implies that his case was weak. Even if he could have taken Mamistra as he had taken Tarsus, the repeated shows of aggression towards a fellow crusader increased the risk of intervention by Bohemond and other leaders. One minor battle was bad enough, but still far from the disaster that an expanding crisis, possibly splitting the whole army into two hostile parties, would have caused. Now I'm watching the clock. Is it so that I have 1 minute left?
No, you have a bit longer, 5 minutes or so.
5 minutes or so. Okay, so maybe I'll take one more example of greed, but then I leave looting and go directly into conclusions, so not to rob too much time from the others.
Not to loot.
But I saw it. After the conquest of Jerusalem, the princes who remained in the Holy Land continued their efforts to capture the coastal cities. In Latakia, Bohemond managed to take hold of two citadels, which were situated crucially in respect of collecting dues from the sailors. While capturing them, he caused some of the Latin Christian guards to be killed and had others blinded and thrown from the towers. Furthermore, he lied to his Pisan and Genoese allies, telling them that Latakian people were wicked opponents of Christians, although the city was inhabited by Greek Christians. In besieging Latakia, Bohemond also broke an oath he and the other princes had given the Byzantine emperor, the legitimate overlord of the city. This injustice led to complaints of the use of force against the Latakian Christians. Bishop Daiberg of Pisa defended the Pisan contingent by claiming that Bohemond had deceived them into fighting and killing their brethren. Bishop and the leaders of an auxiliary force dispatched from Jerusalem sent envoys to Bohemond, who refused to give up the parts of the city he had invaded. In protest, the bishop withdrew from the siege with the Pisans and Genoese, which eventually forced Bohemond to remove his own forces from the city. And then we must looting and go on for conclusions. Clerical and lay treatises raise the following issues in connection with warfare, troops, and knights: pillage, extortion, oppression of tenants, attacks on churchmen, burning of churches, encouraging illegal warfare, and killing other Christians in battle. In line with these notions, the sources of the First Crusade lament killing, enslaving, and terrorizing commoners, plundering churches, and persecuting ecclesiastics. However, such incidents are, with few exceptions, discussed in terms of Muslim offenses against Christians. Only rarely is inter-Christian strife mentioned, while Crusaders' involvement in comparable attacks against Muslims are not seen as blameworthy. It is essential to keep in mind that sources were produced to propagate the achievements of the Holy War after the journey had resulted in the successful conquest of Jerusalem. The descriptions of unacceptable motives and behavior are included only to show that only righteous crusaders reached their goal, and even they only after sinning, repenting, and struggling heroically. It is a dramatic tale of a narrow victory achieved by the grace of God. Many inconvenient strands that might have confused this picture of how the course of events unfolded, a picture developed from hindsight after the success of the crusade, as well as in accordance with the beliefs and expectations of the authors, are likely to have been omitted. Homicides out of hatred are not to be found in the accounts of the First Crusade, depicting brethren participating in an armed pilgrimage that formed a unity comparable to an extended familia. Most of the atrocities attributed to the Crusaders by the sources were not criminal according to contemporary Western tradition. Firstly, European laws mostly regulated relations between Christians within Christian realms. Secondly, violence practiced against non-believers outside Christendom was not a sin if the use of force was intended for the defense of Christians or vengeance for God. In such cases, a crusader was not liable for legal or penitential consequences. As detestable as the alleged devouring human bodies or killing little children would be in the eyes of the authors, these deeds did not transgress the canon law or lay law codes of the Western societies if the victim was a non-believer presiding under a non-Christian authority. The judgmental comments were based on presumably sinful intentions and little else. Slaying, robbing, and maiming a fellow Christian was basically evil. The reactions among the Crusader army, as described by the sources, show that the Crusaders disapproved of strife among themselves, both because they felt it strong and because it endangered the holy purpose of the crusade. Evidence from the latter part of the 12th century onward shows that Crusaders who physically attacked their brothers in arms could be punished harshly. The paradox of Crusader violence is that fighting both condemns and expiates. In the words of William Tyre, to turn one's arms against the enemies of God, already doomed to hell, may obtain pardon for those guilty of theft, arson, rapine, and homicide, and calm the anger of God. Consequently, the quintessential injunction to fight well, gain victory, and win spoils was a gift from God to his faithful people. The sources of the First Crusade accept looting the homes and property of non-combatants and prisoners of war, as well as attacking non-Christian religious institutions in the absence of a treaty that would have specifically excluded these people and institutions from hostilities. At the beginning of the 12th century, the concept of civilian rights per se did not yet exist, although the sources agree on the principle of clerical and penitential immunity in the Christian case. For crusaders, fighting for good ends and salvation were keenly connected, but exactly how was unclear for the lack of practical guidance from the church. The first crusaders did what they could. They confessed their sins and partook in communion before entering into battle, and some of them prayed while attacking their enemies. But the eventual victory or defeat was the final token of the acceptability of the measures taken. The problem remained that fundamentally the virtue of intention that defined the quality of actions and predicted their outcome was difficult to evaluate. Fighting, atonement, and suffering cohere into an inseparable entity in the sources of the First Crusade. Thank you.
Anna, do we do questions now?
I'm training my role as the during the session. I think we will take a few questions now and then move on to the speaker. So please do. Want to think about it a little bit longer, we can proceed and then we can go back to around the questions later. Somebody wants to, oh.
Thank you for a great talk. I when it comes to the speech at the beginning of what you say, I see there's a lot of throwing back and forth of body parts, and the chronicler sort of described that the people who were receiving them were very upset with it. There was a lot of crying going on in both sides. I was wondering how that fits into your idea of acceptable.
Oh, yes, this is part of the stuff that I have cut off from here. So are you now speaking about chronicles and historiography or literature? Okay, which of course in case of severe cases is the same fiction. Anyway, yes, so in both cases, I think that both Crusaders and Muslims used psychological warfare. They used the tactic of swinging or flinging severe heads, both for to cause fear and also to contaminate. And of course, as we know from the case of Black Death, this can be an efficient tactic to win or cause harm. Then of course maiming would have been legal. Well, I'm not speaking of beheading enemies, which of course is a common practice in medieval warfare or whatever culture, but also if we go to maiming as part of any body parts and part of legal systems, that would have been included in at least Byzantine law, laws of Normandy, and several other regions also in Europe. Probably, I don't know Muslim legislation of the age, but I wouldn't be surprised to find the practice there as well. So, and when we go to literature, then of course severe heads receive even more space, and we have stories, and also find the same stories in Chronicles of the First Crusade, also for people paying, giving severed heads as gifts or token of loyalty, and also people paying for receiving heads of the enemy. I haven't found any notions of crusaders beheading their own, like, seriously injured people who couldn't have been saved. I found one notion of this kind from the Baltic Crusades, but in this case, it's the pagan Lithuanians who are accused of like killing their own, like, strike of mercy, but it's probably added it's probably just added there to show how bloodthirsty and bad people these pagans are. I wonder if I answered your question in a way.
First off, thank you for a very interesting paper. I'm sad you had to cut out the looting because I quite enjoy looting myself. So, I'll have to
Okay.
ask you about that.
Yeah,
at some point.
several heads as well.
You mentioned that certain sort of deprivations are associated with this idea of kind of cruelty is sort of something that's going too far. And in the case of hunger, I was wondering if there was any sense in which, kind of populations in the locality are thought to be acting sort of cruelly by, say, withholding markets for provisioning and sort of weaponizing that deprivation as a sort of example of cruelty, as a sort of passive form of wickedness.
No, it's actually other way around. Is it exactly hunger that is cruel? And hunger that is cruelly attacking crusaders. Crusaders, what the sources say of the people say that they were afraid.
Mhm.
They didn't dare enter Crusaders' camp, or then the enemy stopped them doing so. So they were either afraid of the Crusader or their adversaries. And there is actually in your handout there is one, but very last example, I suppose. Yes. Of the inhabitants, the first Crusaders met on the way, and who couldn't be persuaded of selling them any victuals, and by the end, because they were afraid that these pilgrims would come and loot and kill, and by the end they looted them, and also it seems that of course looting was the means of keeping a major army together.
Yes, of course.
And
thus kind
the
of
longer
ipso facto
away
a good
they
thing.
went from home,
Yeah.
the more important looting became.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, I'm familiar with that passage, and it sort of struck me that there is a kind of sort of undercurrent of sort of justification that, well, these people have made a mistake and maybe they were afraid, but what else was the Crusaders meant to do? And if the decision then is between sort of taking these provisions by force or the campaign falling apart, sort of, the one side is just ultimately because it is the continuation.
Of course, and it's interesting that the Gesta returns the same matter a bit later. I've got here if you need references which shows that actually probably looting has been done also in the meanwhile.
Yes, yeah.
So which is common practice, and it's especially that the sources mention that some of the readers at some point prohibit and tell their troops not to loot, and this is usually especially like written out that at this point this and that leader said that we don't loot here, which I think is noteworthy.
Thanks, Amy. Clerical sources, obviously, what you were talking about. I was wondering if Caparo of Genoa, as a layman, has a slightly different take on things, and given his perspective as somebody who, there's charters by the time you go to 1147, pretty well saying it's the God of the gold. By the time you get to the sort of 1140s in Iberia, has he got any kind of different? Did you look at him as somebody offering a different perspective?
I'm basically here. This paper had been limited with sources of the First Crusade, but I think there's a common attitude from the beginning that plunder is a gift from God. That in a way shows that the means are acceptable, and of course they're very happy always to get a lot of plunder. So there are long lists of what they have taken from people they were meeting on the way. So there doesn't seem to be any contradiction. It's a victory. It's part of victory and gift of God, and somehow also a token that the means taken can be completely rational. That there's something good in their intention if they proceed with the campaign.
Okay, thank you.
This is of course very simple physiology and not signed by learned
work.
people in
It's work.
Europe.
Yeah.
Yes. So if Kaffar is saying that the gold or what is gold or no,
But I suppose.
Gold
I think
or
that I would be
gold.
Wrong, but.
I would say in this case that it's gold and gold, but
No,
almost the same thing.
I suppose I was thinking early on, something like 1104 an acre, I think some people are very critical of the Genoese there. He's okay with it.
But think about Conrad, who spoiled the temple. He spoiled the temple and took the goods, the money, and he was really rebuked. And basically, he defended himself, saying that it's justified because he just took the money for the needed and paid for his army. And apparently, and here I'm thinking of William Tyrrell, which is of course later source, but here I really think that if I have been reading William Tyrrell right, which I'm not for sure after listening to Professor Keda yesterday, is that actually I think that Tancred was allowed to keep part of the temple spoiled in Jerusalem, which tells a lot about the attitude towards looting.
One
Sorry?
question then we'll move on.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. I was really interested in what you were saying about unlawful violence, and in particular avarice and the motive. Is this something that already existed in Western Europe, these concepts before the First Crusade, or do you think it's something that came out of the First Crusade?
No, let's see. I'm at least avarice and the root sins. At least I am quoting here Victor of San. I have to find it. But it's a very good question. Let's see. It's a Crusader Chronicles, violence. No, Hugh of Saint Victor, later out of Lyon. John Cassian. It's older, and I'm sure there are also others. The idea of root sins is older, and for me it was a surprise that actually violentia stems from avarice. That the word is actually it's a crime that is connected always to some kind of material compensation.
Yeah. So I think it's just very interesting because later, of course, it's something that's frequently levied at the military orders. You know, things go wrong because they're greedy.
So, but then, of course, for instance, if looting is that important,
Yes,
so they go
yeah.
together. So killing and money, and maybe for us in our society, if somebody is killed, there's usually some there can be monetary gain. But often, if we think about crimes of passion or which we are reading from papers and like that, there are other kind of motivations.
If I can just quickly add, in the Gospel of St. Luke, I think Roman soldiers go to John the Baptist and ask what they can do to receive salvation. I think these men are meant to be sort of Jewish auxiliaries, and he explicitly says, don't use your physical prowess, don't use the fact that you are kind of military men to exploit the poor and make money out of them. And that's his kind of chief commandment. So that link between, as you say, avarice and violence, I think is very deep.
Thank you, Celine, very much for this fact itself. One now
Excuse me.
And moving from war to war for peace. And in our case, the war was holy and the peace was definitely unholy. Both sides to the Crusader-Muslim conflict in the medieval Latin East perceived this conflict as a holy war. In the West, the Crusades were fueled by the revolutionary movements of the Pax Dei and of Holy War initiated by the Church. In the East, the ideology of jihad as a collective holy struggle was formulated as a religious precept. In both societies, however, holy war was carried out not by the religious, but by the lay authorities. Thus, the 2 centuries of the Crusades in the Middle East were a meeting place between 2 ideologies of holy war. But during and after the conquest of the Holy Land, in the middle of these holy wars, there were many peace treaties between Muslims and Christians. During this period, peacemaking was a valid alternative to the battlefield. These peaceful endeavors serve as examples of prevention and resolution of enmity and clarify the means used to achieve peace in what was purportedly the most extreme of wars. How could one make peace in a holy war? If not a clash between civilizations, then at least a clash between religions. Concord is a narrative forgotten in the standard readings of history and consequently in the historical caricatures that inform our collective memories, says Fossil. This paper treats how the Christians and Muslims address this problem of making unholy peace to end holy war. From the religious perspective, there was no lack of an ideology of peace in the medieval arena. Both Christian Latins and Muslims believed in an eschatological universal peace based on harmony of a just, victorious religion and society, a peace that would end all wars. But the ideal of peace usually meant first intra-religious peace, the sulh between Muslim believers or the peace between Christian co-religionists. As for peace with the infidels, the ideal final peace was based on victory. Whether it was the Augustinian ideal in which peace achieved by warfare, if necessary, meant that Christendom would reign from sea to sea, or the Muslim peace that meant victory over all infidels and the worldwide reign of the true religion. War was a way to maintain world order and to keep the peace. In actuality, there was scant connection between the lofty notions of the ideal peace and the perceptions and practices of real peacemaking. One possible answer to the dilemma of peacemaking in holy war lies in the loopholes between principles and practices. Whether Milis Christi or Mujahideen, the holy warriors were at the same time pragmatic military leaders and, when expedient, preferred peace to war and were willing to sign treaties. From the very early military encounters between Muslims and Crusaders, negotiations for peace were a viable option, and more than 100 treaties and alliances were signed during the 2 centuries of the Crusaders' stay in the East. However, as the ideal was holy war, a pretext or an explanation was usually needed to justify peace. None was needed for war. One of the fundamental principles of peacemaking in Islam is sulh, which refers to the settlement of disputes through peaceful negotiation and compromise. In Islamic law, sulh is a preferred means of resolving disputes, and Muslims are encouraged to seek it before resorting to other measures. But this peace is usually directed at internal wars, not at infidels. Toward them, jihad, struggling for the sake of God, was a religious precept. Peace meant victory of Islam and tolerance of the subjected enemy, as we heard this morning, provided they were not polytheists or in Khal. The ideal was undoubtedly jihad, but a jihad was a collective, not a personal obligation. This meant that not every political leader had to necessarily prefer speech on jihad in a mosque outside Damascus in 1105, he tried to refute this notion and claimed that in the case of the Crusades, jihad was indeed an individual duty. The hijrah and jihad are the concern of the Muslims, each and every one of them. And one could not hide behind the thought that other fighters for jihad could manage without one's help. The least that the Imam must do is that he allow no year to pass without having organized a military expedition by himself or his raiding parties, according to the Muslims' interests. We'll come back to that. So that jihad will only be stopped in a year for a valid excuse. He, al-Shafi, said, if not enough people join the expeditionary force, those who stay behind must be sent out as well, and consider as an obligation that which God be praised said. But al-Sulami's principles did not seem to convince most of his contemporaries. Towards an enemy like the Crusaders, Hudna was a viable solution, that is, a temporary truce or ceasefire between warring parties. Islamic law recognizes Hudna as a legitimate means of ending hostilities and making room for negotiations and peacemaking. The requirements for Hudna in Islamic jurisprudence include consent of all parties, temporality, namely a specified limited time frame, and it goes with years, months, days, and even hours, clear terms, non-violence and cessation of hostilities during the Hudna period, and good faith and mutual trust. Overall, these requirements underscore the importance of clear communication, mutual trust, and a commitment to peaceful negotiation and conflict resolution. Although these principles provide a framework for ending hostilities and building peace, the ideal remains jihad. The preference for either Hudna or jihad depends on the specific context and the goals and objectives of the parties involved. The relevant conditions for Hudna encompass almost all possible scenarios, ranging from entering into a treaty from a position of power in order to avoid further bloodshed and on some occasion to gain more time for obtaining reinforcements and supplies, a position of equilibrium in order to settle differences for which combat was not seen as desirable, and a position of weakness in order to make the best of an adverse, complex situation and perhaps to gain time for planning and readjustment. In other words, all possibilities. And outsiding principles that came into play as a rationale for treaty making was the best interest, we saw that before, of the Islamic community, Maslaha. According to Shaybani Siyal, treaty making was permissible if deemed expedient by the Imam. That is, in theory at least, the religious authority was supposed to make decisions in what we would call lay matters. But in fact, the decision rested with the lay sovereign. As a Hudna was in principle not peace, but only a temporary respite from war, it could be renewed according to above principles, and as such constituted a sufficient loophole to enable the negotiations of treaties even for extended periods. And I'll provide some specific examples of how this was implemented. The temporary Hudna was not necessarily at all peace. In many cases, it included friendship, diplomatic relations, free trade, and regulated coexistence, as in Ibn al-Kalanis' description of the negotiation for a truce between Ridwan of Aleppo and Baldwin in 1114. A correspondence was carried on between him, Ridwan, and Baldwin, king of the Franks, with a view to the conclusion of an armistice and establishment of amicable and peaceful relations between them, in order that the provinces might be restored to cultivation after the devastation, and the roads be secured from the malice of evildoers and robbers. An agreement was reached between them to this effect, and each of them took an oath to the other to observe faithfully and loyally the terms of the treaty and live in friendship and peace. Thus, the roads and provinces were made safe, conditions became normal, and produce was abundant. The rationale of secure roads and enable economic profit was seen as a sufficient pretext to promote peace. It may well be that the shared willingness of both sides to make what I've called small temporary peace, not the big one, was finally what made peace possible. We also find the use of theological pretexts. During the negotiations with Richard the Lionheart in 1192, Saladin's advisors pushed him to accept peace using a theological rationale. It is more advisable that we accept what God had said in the verse, which revealed, namely, if they seek peace, accept it. For only then people could go back to their lands and raise crops. Troops could replenish the supplies and get respite from the vicious conflict. Should war resume, we will be ready and well prepared with food and fodder, not exhausted and penniless. For it is during the days of peace that we get ready for war and prepare the instruments of fighting. It is not an abandonment of religious duties, jihad, but rather a period of renewal and improvement. As for the Franks, they are deceitful and do not observe their oaths. Make truce with the leaders so that they live and disperse. For the first decades of conflict between the invading Crusaders and the besieged Muslim cities, the initiative for ceasefire, peace treaties, and even Muslim-Christian alliances came from the Muslim side. And it seems that the Crusaders learned from the conquered Muslims. That's an idea Milka revealed from the first conquest, but it seems to have worked the same way with the Crusaders. The first Crusaders saw no contradiction between a firm, even enthusiastic belief in their tasks as warriors of Christ, who was fighting in the ranks and even contributing miracles when needed, and their pragmatic role as military leaders and founders of principalities in the north and the Latin kingdom. Personal gain and even greed did not necessarily contradict crusading fervor, as we have heard and seen. Although the Crusaders voiced notions of ethnic cleansing and freeing the holy places from the polluting existence of the infidels, and their very brutal conquest of cities, culminating with the conquest of Jerusalem, which included massacres, that was not a realistic way to establish a Latin kingdom in the East. Peacemaking could either be given a theological rationale by defining holy war as not incompatible with peace processes, or a practical rationale by defining reasons as to why, in a specific instance, it was imperative to end the warfare. This certainly had its sunnier sides, both financial, large sums of tribute paid, and political, large territories ceded to the superior military power. Notwithstanding the ideals of holy war, the parties to the conflict seem to have been more concerned with finding a cultural language that could serve as a platform for agreements and ways to implement those agreements than with religious forms about signing them. A different picture emerges from the theoretical ideologies. The Latin chroniclers were usually clerics who firmly believed but were not supposed to take an active part in holy war. They viewed peacemaking as a sign of weakness and even moral deficiency. Thus, William of Tyre is a good example that I didn't use in here. Thus, circa 1217, the irate bishop Jacques de Vitry rather unrealistically contrasted the Levantine Franks, the Pulani, These are ideal fighters of the First Crusade. The children who are called Pulani were brought up in luxury, soft and effeminate, more used to baths than to battles, addicted to unclean and riotous living. How slow and slothful, how timid and cowardly they proved themselves against the enemies of Christ is doubted by no one who know how greatly they were despised by the Saracens. A multitude of Saracens would flee from before their fathers, even though there were few. At the voice of their thunder, they hastened away. But they feared their descendants no more than so many women, unless they had some French or other Westerner with them. They make treaties with the Saracens and are glad to be at peace with Christ's enemies. They are quick to quarrel with one another and skirmish and levy civil war against one another. They often called upon the enemies of faith to help them against Christians. This contemptuous description of the later generations of Franks is fundamentally true. The Pulani did indeed make alliances with Muslim leaders, sometimes against their co-religionists, and in the long run preferred peacemaking to warfare. These peacemaking practices made possibly coexistence on the same strip of land, especially in the period after the Battle of Hattin, when the Holy Land was divided between Franks and the Ayyubids. But the Vitry's supposedly ideal First Crusaders were in fact no better. Already in 1097, they made alliances with Muslims, Godfrey and Abdul of Azaz, and probably tried to form an alliance with Fatimid Egypt before taking Jerusalem from them. They were more successful than the Vitry's contemporaries, but were not averse to peacemaking from the very first encounters with the Muslim world. For the Crusaders, the early treaties represented a way to formalize territorial and financial gains. Thus, treaties served rather as a pragmatic way to address a particular situation, not a step toward eternal peace and friendship. This small peace was temporal. It could be explained as solving a pressing problem and therefore necessary, but also had positive results. It could be prolonged, and propagandists could even persuade their audiences that it was an achievement. When Richard the Lionheart signed the Treaty of Jaffa with Saladin in 1192, Amboise explained that the king had informed his opponent that he had done so in order to gain respite and to organize a new war. This explanation, according to Amboise, was cautiously accepted by Saladin, who also preferred a temporary treaty. Richard informed Saladin that he needed a year to return home, a year to mobilize a new crusade, and a year to return. Behad-Din ibn Shaddad explains the same treaty, quote, "Nevertheless, he, Saladin, saw the advantage in making peace because the army was weary and showing signs of disaffection. The real benefit was in something that God knew of. For a little after the treaty, his death occurred. Had that happened in the course of hostilities, Islam would have been in peril. The peace was nothing but a providential blessing for him." As it happened, neither leader was able to resume fighting 3 years later. Saladin died some months after Richard's departure. The Lionheart was taken captive and detained in Austria until ransomed and never returned to the Holy Land. In the meantime, despite its temporary nature, 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days, the treaty was kept by the successors in the Holy Land. It also became the basis for the next treaty and consolidated the achievement of the Third Crusade. Its clauses framed the territorial base for the Second Latin Kingdom, which ensured European presence in the East for another century until 1291. The short-term character of a small peace was not what made it durable and sometimes even relatively long-lasting. After fighting the Holy War to a standstill, the two sovereign kings reached an rational agreement backed by explanations that could be accepted by the religious advisors and chroniclers. The later treaties, when the Franks were the underdog, were harder to explain. An extreme example is a treaty signed in 1221 after the resounding failure of the Fifth Crusade in Egypt. It also illustrates the problem of religious involvement in peacemaking. The Crusade started out as a great military success with the Crusader conquest of Damietta, November 5th, 1290, seen by Matthew Paris. And the Pope's legate, Pelagius, hoped that they would crush Egypt once and for all. The Sultan Al-Kamil offered treaty terms in which he would give back the entire western part of the Holy Land, including Jerusalem, in exchange for lifting the siege of Damietta. Despite the fact that the King John of Brienne was in favor of this proposal, the treaty was rejected in autumn 1290. 2 years later, after the military failure, the Crusader had to sign a treaty that granted them their lives and captives and promised to return the Holy Cross, lost at the Battle of Hattin, in exchange for Damietta. Oliver of Paderborn explained, "Let all posterity know that in view of our necessity, we made an excellent bargain. When the wood of our redemption was restored to us in exchange for one city, which Christianity could not hold for long, since grain and wheat is spoiled there in less than a year, and the master of Egypt can hardly keep it people. And with so many thousands of captives in whose number we counted ourselves, from the greatest to the least, were restored to their own freedom." Read bargain. Earlier, Oliver described the same city in glowing colors that faded when necessity made a treaty imperative. Thus, in a situation when the Crusaders had to settle for a treaty of capitulation, the chronicler felt a need to offer an explanation and pretext. The Rosling continuation of William of Tyre explains why Al-Kamil's earlier generous offer was not acceptable. Safaddin and all his sons, that is Al-Kamil, wanted to give back to the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Christians all the land the Christians were holding at the time they lost it, and pay them a large sum each year, on the understanding that there should be permanent peace between themselves and the Christians. Such a peace, however, did not please the Christians, so that the plan failed. For the Christians said that they would never make peace with the unbelievers. It would be against God and against reason. A permanent, durable peace was illegal, contre Dieu and contre raison. That's the same words used in the thesis when something is a law. Oliver too thought that the early refusal was justified, but he gave logical reasons. The Transjordanian fortresses were important for the defense of the western part of the country, and therefore Pelagius was correct when he rejected the peace treaty. The king's advice to accept the proposed treaty went unheeded. This is later, but it shows the way the Pope thought should be done. Indeed, the king did not mention that he had been in favor of the earlier offer when he himself wrote to the Pope. The king thought that he should lead and attempted to curb the ecclesiastical intervention. Modern historians attribute the disastrous results of the Fifth Crusade to the conflict between the church and the lay leadership. The peace treaty signed between Frederick II and Al-Kamil in 1229 was criticized by religious authorities and political rivals on both sides. Frederick achieved, without firing a single shot, the return of Jerusalem without the Temple Mount to Christian rule and a 10-year treaty. He succeeded by both Richard the Lionheart and the leaders of 2 subsequent crusades had failed. Nonetheless, the Pope excommunicated Frederick both before and after. And the papal legate Jerome placed an interdict on the holy city itself. The local nobility was shocked and disgusted by Frederick's entering into a treaty without consulting them and without even first trying the alternative of holy war. The Muslim side was also shocked. Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, prompted by Al-Kamil's rival Nasr Daoud, whose territory he had given away, delivered a fiery sermon in Damascus and claimed that the whole Muslim world shook with the indignation because of the division of Jerusalem. But this temporary scandalous peace was kept for 10 years and prolonged for another 5. Al-Kamil did not lose his prominent position in the Muslim Ayyubid world, and even Nasr Daoud, who tried to reconquer Jerusalem in 1239, ended up signing a treaty in 1240 that left Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount, in Christian hands. Here are the different treaties as far as mapped slightly and quite clumsily colored by me. In 1244, Jerusalem fell to Khwarizmian army and was lost to Christendom. After a short stay in the Holy Land, Frederick returned disappointed to Italy and resumed his fight with the Pope there. In contrast, the most Christian King Louis IX was accepted as an ideal crusader in spite of his total military failure in Egypt in 1250, repeating the mistakes of the Fifth Crusade and ending up as a captive who had to ransom himself and his army for Damietta and a huge sum of money. But when he at last landed in Acre, the local received him with great honor and accepted him as a king de facto. He lacked the diplomatic skills of Frederick and did not sign a treaty. Thus, strong lay leadership did not always promise peace, and ideal fighters of holy war did not necessarily succeed. On the other hand, the religious leadership, as in the case of Pelagius, failed to achieve peace, security, or victory. The ascendants. This is the treaty between Richard of Cornwall and the Sultan of Spain. One of the very, very rare illustrations of peace. If you take Matthew Paris, he has countless descriptions of war, which some seem very, very bloody. This is really an exception, and it shows the way peace was done, not by the written source, but by the body language. The ascendance of the Mamluks changed the balance of power. They too used jihad as a political propaganda in order to strengthen rule and force the Latin adversaries to ask time and again for a respite that was never fully honored. In the final analysis, the numerous temporary peace treaties did not suffice to prevent the relentless effort to push the Franks into the sea in the name of jihad. The Frankish kingdom disintegrated, and each political unit, the military orders, diverse cities, and lordship, each strived to save themselves by entering individual treaties. But shifting historical circumstances led to the expulsion of the Crusaders from the Latin East, thus ending the peacemaking endeavors. Ultimately, what caused peace to fail was not ideology, but the balance of power in Europe, the Middle and Far East, the economic changes that rendered the European trade communes redundant and expendable. Whereas Western Catholicism had to slowly resign itself to the loss of the Holy Land, the peace achieved by the Mamluk Empire was one of victory, with no need to share sovereignty with any infidel. Thank you.
We will now take some questions. I also want to inform you that now officially you have the bios for all the participants just right 5 minutes ago, finally. So because we are not doing an introduction per speaker, you can follow the speakers in alphabetically order. Please, questions to Yvonne.
This might be quite a simple question, but I was wondering for the first time that whether doctrinally it actually was easier for Christians to make peace than for Muslims. Because I was thinking that of course in holy wars, they are just a special case of just war based upon Roman principle. And isn't it so that the idea of Roman law is just that if you can restore somehow the status quo before warfare, that's the idea of making peace. What do you think? Would it have been like ideologically more easy for crusaders than their adversaries to make truces and peaces in holy war?
It might in principle, but as we saw, it didn't work so in practice. Not that they didn't make peace treaties, they did.
Mhm.
And Charles already said that there were more years of peace and of war. That of course, that's the nature of treaties. They're supposed to be for more years than short battles. On both sides, one had to explain. In Islam, it was imperative. It had to be part of the treaty to explain why peace was necessary. But there were so many loopholes that almost any explanation would work. And at least in the beginning, they took the initiative because the upper hand was the Crusades, and they came and asked for peace. And the Crusaders were delighted. They brought gifts, they brought tributes, they gave land. So they accepted it gracefully. Things they had to explain. It was more difficult, of course, as the situation became more difficult. And I think Oliver is a good example of trying to explain away something that couldn't be seen as a great bargain by any. I would have liked to show that it was a question of ideology. But you see it only, the chroniclers sometimes do. William of Tyre will say that it's a shame that people became captives instead of dying as heroes in battles. He was sitting at his desk. But he also says that sometimes war is a result of greed, and peace had better sides. He described peace. Now peace is reigning, and there's commerce, and people can come into the city and even take souvenirs home. He has very colorful descriptions of peace.
I was wondering if you could perhaps say something about the kind of this sort of ebb and flow of the desire for war. Towards the beginning, when you quoted the kind of mandate to commit to jihad every year, it reminded me of part of Ibn Hakal's description of Sicily when he travels there in the 10th century. And he visits these kind of rabats, these religious houses that are meant to house the warriors for jihad. And he says that in this kind of typical Ibn Hakal fashion, he sort of describes them as like doss houses. He says that guys show up here to kind of get their room and board, and they're not really interested in jihad anymore because everyone's too wealthy on Sicily. They've got too much land. They're growing lemons now, and everyone loves that. Is it something you kind of see in the Holy Land? You said about kind of commerce sort of taking really precedent.
Yes. Economic explanations are very common.
Mm.
It's not honorable for a Christian to say that he signed a peace because it had economic advantages. But a Muslim would say it without hesitation. That's absolutely okay.
Okay.
The question I cited Al-Sulami, but there's a discussion there. Is he
right? Yeah.
Is he the great preacher of jihad that had slowly but surely an influence on Zengi, etc., and he made the difference? Muad thinks that was the case, but it was a small mosque outside Damascus. We don't know how many people came there and how big was the influence. On the other hand, I must admit that when I came to Clermont the first time, I was shocked at how small the place outside the church was. I had imagined something huge for the speech of Urban. But then, of course, it was a church council, and he had the whole length of bishops that could disseminate the idea. Sulami didn't have it, and I don't think his idea of personal precept, everyone has to do jihad, had much of a resonance.
I'm interested in this divergence between ideology and practice, if one may put it in these terms. Where would you say is the line between the two? Is this a line between clerics and laymen? Is it a line between East and West? Or is it perhaps a line depending on the type of text that you are looking at? What's your opinion on that?
The kind of text we are looking at is certainly important. I mean, that then it goes without saying that is clerics, because they are the ones who write.
Mhm.
But it seems that it's more, it's a sovereign's prerogative, just like making war, he might make peace. And it's his right to do it. And the ideologists can explain it and can embellish on it and makes the warriors give sermons, makes the military work better. But he decides when it's speaking for him or not. In principle, it is the man to decide. In practice, it's usually the king who does it. There's one point I didn't go into that. I thought it was interesting. I mean, the Jews didn't have it. They couldn't make either peace or war. The only thing they could do was to ransom the captives and alleviate the results of war. And yet, the only important treatise about war and peace is Maimonides in our period. And surprisingly, I mean, I would expect him to write about peace. He doesn't. He writes about the glorious king who will make war. So when you come to ideologies, Isaiah and his prophecies, that's for the end of days. And the Lamb we use both. Either have to be a new land every day, or it's not something that will happen. Actually, Maimonides says it's just a metaphor. In the meantime, the one can decide for practical reasons if it's worthwhile or not. Usually delay the ceremony.
So is it fair to say that whatever ideological justifications there are for making peace or war, ultimately they're never more than a gloss on two sides, that it would come to a similar agreement about peace or war if they were the same, if there was no religious component to it at all?
Take the movement of the crusade. It's hard to explain it just as a practical war. There, the ideology has important historical results. And to see just from economic and social reasons, I think it's to misunderstanding. Those were people who came to fight in the name of Christ.
I mean, I can't think of a war that doesn't have an ideology. That's
Yeah, they're all.
Well, but I mean, the later treaties in the 12th century were not made with crusaders, they were made with Frankish nobles.
Yes.
Right, and they're not engaged in becoming.
Mhm.
So you could say that those were treaties outside of, at least from the Frankish perspective, outside of Holy War.
I think the whole thing works because both sides are not looking for a permanent peace. They're looking for a short time. Treaties that would work. But that's what makes it work.
Yeah, Iris and I are just doing some on-the-spot research, fixation, because for our things, we blur whether things are in the press or whether they're out yet. But there is an article by a young German scholar called Benedikt Breyer, which talks about Sulami and talks and cautions against people overusing him and sort of treating him as the super important, making him too important. And the evidence that he puts forward are the sort of attendance certificates at his performances. And I think it's only presented twice by him, and then maybe by his son or his nephew or something like that later. I can't remember the details, but the numbers are still pretty second time is in the 11 teens.
The numbers are very
So
small.
it is kind
The
of,
manuscripts are.
but he's easy in a sense because it's so, what he says is so sort of fits Nur al-Din and Saladin so beautifully. And oh yes, you know, this is the guy who called it right sort of 60 years early, and he was just ahead of his time. It's sort of quite a sort of easy sort of romantic sort of line to draw. But this man sort of is like, well, okay, you can have those ideas down the line, but careful with the straight line between the two.
Yeah, but the
on
poetry
that
we heard
basis.
this morning from Anne, it's a slightly different perspective. It's more than we usually tend to think.
Yeah. But I think that, I mean, here you see like maybe very much a disjunction between what certain like literary elites would want versus what the political elites prioritized and wanted, right? And that they're trying to serve as like the moral voice, like you should be doing this, poke, and the leaders are like, nah, other problems.
Yeah.
until you have people like Zengi and Nuruddin are like, okay, now's the time.
And they too fought more wars against the co-religionists than against.
Exactly. Higher priorities. In their life.
The paper is out, it's called The Reception of Jihad Treaties.
Reception of
Jihad Treaties by Benedikt Breyer. It's in Crusades. Some publicity for Crusades.
There'll be more of that.
I think this is a good time to move to our next speaker. участвовать, and we will thank one another for there's more coffee outside if you want to grab some and tea. There's hot water just outside the room. I'm not taking any breaks, but feel free to recharge.
So thank you very much for putting together this, what looks like a really interesting workshop, and for the invitation, for which I'm very grateful, not least because in fact, I took part of in a workshop much like this one, I think in 2008, 2009 in Budapest, in the Central European University, and which invited many prominent historians, and it was very meaningful for the way I came to think about these questions. So hopefully this one becomes this workshop becomes central in how some of the people who are participating here think about these problems. And also I have to say that that workshop in 2009, I think it was really more like a workshop, and so scholars came in and workshop the sources, and that's the strategy that I chose for today, unlike the first very rich and formal papers that we've heard. So I'll do a short framing. I will bring together some sources that hopefully will illustrate or animate the way my approach or my attitude towards the sources, and I welcome your comments and contributions. So maybe it will be somewhat more of a discussion than in a paper. So again, I'll start with a little bit of theoretical framing. In terms of my the title that I chose, I think belligerent spiritualities doesn't need much explaining. Basically, I choose this as a kind of umbrella term to refer to a range of attitudes towards the sense in which engaging in violence and or force is thought to be something that also conveys a sense of religious duty, whether the authors or describing somebody else or referring to the enemy or rival. But co-production is a little bit more elusive. And in this term, I refer to or rely on the work of David Nirenberg, who warns, I suppose, of the fact that oftentimes we get warns of the fact that we in a sense inherits a historiography that encourages us to think about ideas on holy war and such like notions in as ones that were created in a polarized environment. But already in their formative moments, the communities that created these traditions took shape through a process of simultaneous identification and disidentification with their rival siblings and neighbors. This has to do with the way the various traditions align themselves vis-a-vis each other in thinking about the validity of their respective scripture and the ways that the scriptural traditions lend themselves to authoritative interpretation relative to each other. But this co-production does not end with its codification in scripture necessarily. Rather, it continues to shape the way communities interpreted their history. Later, or beyond their formative texts and moments, communities brought their own experiences and worries of neighborliness to bear upon their interpretation of scripture, transforming how that scripture can be read in the future in making events and experiences in their turn meaningful. Which results in a fundamental ambivalence of which Nirenberg talks at length. So familiarity with rivaling or neighboring communities is deployed oftentimes in order to claim continuity with the prestige of other communities, or to appropriate its authority. But at the same time, it is invoked in order to distance the believers from the truth claims of other neighboring communities themselves. But this, in a way, is all of this refers to the way scriptures think of themselves, specifically referring to kind of revelational philosophies that Nuremberg finds in the Old Testament and the New Testament and in the Quran. But I employ these ideas on the way authors from the preceding period thought about what I call pious religion, or belligerent spiritualities. And what I try to say is that even as, or because political conflict prevails, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish authors in the Eastern Mediterranean came to imagine the idea of holy war through each other, which is to say that physical and intellectual proximity between neighboring, often hostile communities in the Near East greatly impacted and shaped the very language they used to think about their most fundamental concerns. And so a close reading of the sources, I hope, reveals a dialectic in which the various traditions grew deeply dependent upon one another in their enduring alterity. And what I try to do, and try to hopefully illustrate today, is to trace the discursive strategies of writers who engaged with each other by relying on a common stock of images and themes relating to holy warriors and the spaces they were imagined to protect. And this common stock of images, of course, brings with itself the history of scriptures and fundamental interpretive strategies, but then employed in more contemporaneous context. So obviously authors reflected on the theological repercussions of engaging in war, as the previous talks illustrated, and chroniclers recorded events in their own time or their recent history. But I ask, or I hope to ask, whether the very notion of militant piety also provided Muslim, Christian, and Jewish authors with possibilities for imagining the cultural boundaries and hermeneutical or interpretive codependency. And indeed, what I try to show is that ideas about holy warfare were dynamically co-produced by authors in the Near East as the various communities fought with and about each other on in the context of waging war on behalf of the Holy Land. And so the notion of cultural co-production, which seeks neither to dissolve the singularity of the various traditions, nor to fetishize their difference, lies at the heart of my approach to the sources, which I hope to animate today through 4 short case studies. So the first 2 a little bit more straightforward and well-known, and hopefully the second, the third, and fourth a little bit longer and will require some more framing. So, well, so the first example comes from Jacques de Vicky, and I'll read it out and speak about it. And again, please jump in if you have comments on ways in which you think this illustrates the notion that exists in this text, a sense of co-production. And this comes from Jacques' exemplar, or an exemplar, right, which he is thought to have written after his return from his period as the Bishop of Acre in between the years 1216 and 1225. And he says the following: at first, the brothers of that religious order were regarded as holy by everyone, for which they were exceedingly hated by the Saracens. It happened that a certain noble knight who had traveled from France to Outremer for the sake of pilgrimage was captured along with some soldiers of the Templar order. because he was bold and bore a beard, the Saracens believed he was a Templar and that he should be killed like the other Templars. But the secular knights were not to be killed and instead sent to captivity. But he, as was the truth, said, I am a secular knight and a pilgrim, to which they, the Saracens, responded, on the contrary, you are a Templar. Kindled by the zeal of faith, he said, extending his neck, in the name of the Lord, let me be a Templar. Having said that, and pierced by a sword together with the brethren of the temple, this new Templar traveled to the Lord to be crowned joyfully with martyrdom. So I first take note of the fact that even the framing of this short story begins by attributing to the Saracens an important role. Okay, so one of the reasons for which, or as a result of the fact that the order of the Templars were regarded as holy by everyone, they were exceedingly hated by the Saracens. So there's already cross gazing. And then further on, this whole dialogue places in the side of the Muslims a performative, meaningful establishment of the identity of the person who becomes a Templar. So I note again at the bottom, he says, let me be a Templar. He becomes a Templar. And indeed, he turned out to be not only a Templar or a new Templar, but also a martyr by virtue of the gaze of the Muslim enemy that erroneously, as it were, identified him as a Templar, but fundamentally, in fact, were correct. So that they turned him into a Templar knight, and in fact, he was one and became a martyr by virtue of their faith, of their gaze. But I wonder about the part that is in red in the middle, because the mistake of the Muslim captors is explained in a very loaded way. Because he was bold and bore a beard, the Saracens believed he was a Templar. And I wonder if anybody has thoughts about what could lie behind this particular mistake that is attributed to the Saracens. And I note also that this is an explanation that the author provides. It is never mentioned, assuming that this is at least this is a narrative. He imagines this event. It didn't necessarily happen. And even if it did, then the author took some poetic license, as it were. And he chooses to explain this mistake of the Muslims in this particular way, and it is never mentioned that this is what they said. And so this particular fact about his appearance is offered as the reason for which the Muslims were mistaken. So I wonder why he chose this particular explanation and what may lie behind this. If anyone has an idea.
Right now? Or?
Please, yeah.
No, I have something in mind from my preachers from the Third Crusade, because they speak about both Carlos and Barbatus. Carlos is the monk, Barbatus is the warrior, and then here we have the mixture with the Templars. And there's especially a sermon by Alan of Lille, where he equates the Barba with Fortitudo in a crusade sermon, which is talking about 1187. So for me, it's just seems somehow logical, this blending of knight and monk representing the Templars.
So, thank you. At the very least, what we have here is that the author attributes to the Muslims an identity marker that in fact is correct, in the sense that this is in fact the components that make up a Templar. But the question is whether over the course of the years, this combination of being bold and being bearded could have accumulated more meanings or more force. in the context of the East and the encounters between the warriors on both sides.
You mean, the combination or the fact that he has, for example, a beard, which is connected, like, for example, I'm thinking of El Cid,
Mhm.
and which is, earlier, I think, Jacobi tree, where the beard is connected with bravery and success in fighting against the Muslims, whereas it is a Muslim sign.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
so it's a sign of fortitude, but it's a sign of fortitude among the Muslims that the Christians, praising El Cid, actually take it as a sign of, being a hero. So-
Right.
So
absolutely.
this exists before that. I mean,
Right.
if you mean the combination, then I can.
No,
It's a-
not, the combination maybe is really what makes up a Templar, but
Yes.
the beard. Even in as much as it also has a particularistic history, it's also maybe could be said to have accumulated this notion that
Right.
there is a mutual gaze and that the fortitude that is attributed to the Templars in itself is one that
Derives from-
derive some influence or inspiration from the idea that it is what Muslim warriors
Yeah,
bear, and so that now this combination is somehow hybrid, and it is put in the mouth of the Muslims as one that is indeed correctly one that identifies the Templar. So there's a whole kind of cross gazing that is put in place, and again, I remind you that what the moral of the story, as it were, is that this very correct mistake is the one that is the one that creates this knight who wasn't a Templar before into a Templar in a mark.
I hate to put a very mundane perspective to it. Templars were not supposed to be ransomed. That's part of the rule, although it happened. So they weren't worth anything and could be killed. Whereas a noble knight might be worth a lot of money. And many times the captive was the one who put his price. But if you put it too high, nobody might answer it. And we would be in danger. Too low, we might be killed. So he might be telling the truth. And that's why he's the one who has to give his own price.
So in this sense, in this case, he might be telling the truth in that he's not a Templar because he wants to be ransomed and not killed.
He could have,
Mhm.
but he didn't, which is what made him a martyr.
Right.
He could have saved his life by saying, no, I'm a knight and I'm worth
Right.
so and so.
And yet, as you said, this is kind of practical considerations, and again, for Jacques, the
Because it doesn't fit the story. and so-
no, yeah, but again, he says, let me be a Templar. I become a Templar thanks to this mistake that he attributes to the gaze of the Muslims. Okay, so this kind of illustrates the attitude to the text, also my assumption that within this text, there's a history of cross-gazing and familiarity and the attempt to use ideas that belong to the other as a way to make the message more efficacious. And so now I turn to, I turn to another fairly well-known story from the other side that works another interesting dynamic, I think. And this one comes from the very well-known author Usama ibn Munkib, who wrote a story or text translated by Paul Cobb as the Book of Contemplation. And in this this story, so Usama, just a few words, he died, as you see in 1188, and he was born in Shaiza in Syria. He was the nephew of the Emir, so this is probably coalesced his fate as somebody who attempted to reach some kind of a political influence, but never really reached it, and became this sort of middle way diplomat tried to make it in Damascus and wasn't quite successful, and then in Cairo and wasn't quite successful. So he was all over the place and has gained a very interesting and unique perspective, which he put into his memoir that was discovered in the 19th century and edited, translated several times. So I read from Paul Cobb's translation this really interesting story. And he says, anyone who is recently arrived from the Frankish lands is rougher in character than those who have become acclimated and have frequented the company of Muslims. So in a way, this is the moral of the story. It wants to say that to create a distinction between two groups, those who are more seasoned and experienced, people who have or known their ways in the East, and the newcomers who have different qualities, different identity, I suppose, and either will acquire the character and the qualities of those who stay longer in the East, or will just go back home. But again, not again, but I believe he's doing something more sophisticated than just that, just this distinction. I try to ask what does he achieve through this distinction? And he offers this example. Here's an instance of their rough character. May God abominate them. And that this small curse is a really important reminder that he's not trying to be nice. Okay, he has very severe and austere things to say about some Franks, some Christians in certain conditions. Whenever I went to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem, I would go in and make my way up to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, beside which stood a small mosque that the Franks had converted into a church. When I went into the Al-Aqsa Mosque one day, where the Templars, who are my friends, were, they would clear out that little mosque so that I could pray in it. Okay, so again, he explicitly refers to the Templars who chose this Al-Aqsa compound as their headquarters. He refers to them as his friends, and implicitly, already here in the narrative, he's referring to Templars who belong to the latter group, those who are seasoned and experienced people in the East, and they, he claims, are his friends. So one day, he says, I went into the little mosque, recited the opening formula, God is great, Allahu Akbar, and stood up in prayer. At this, one of the Franks rushed at me and grabbed me and turned my face towards the east, saying, pray like this. So instead of praying south, the newcomer, or that's the explanation coming soon, but this Frank who rushed at him forced his face to the other direction. And so a group of Templars hurried towards him, took hold of the Frank, and took him away from me. I then returned to my prayers. The Frank, the very, very same one, took advantage of their inattention and returned, rushing upon me and turning my face to the east, a second time that is, saying, pray like this. So the Templars came in again, grabbed him and threw him out. They apologized to me, saying, explaining the reason for this, and that is, this man is a stranger. I'm not sure stranger is the best translation here, but he's a newcomer. He's somebody from outside, just arrived from the Frankish lands sometime in the past few days. He has never before seen anyone who did not pray towards the east. So I think I've prayed enough, said Usama, and left. And he concludes this short narrative. I used to marvel at the devil, the change of his expression, the way he trembled, and what he must have made of seeing someone praying towards Mecca. So at the face of it, I already mentioned, I think it is clear that what Usama is doing is that he's forging a distinction between two groups. One, as I said, is the people who belong to this space or this area, or seasoned and experienced, and And it doesn't matter, and the seasoned and experienced Franks, who he says are characterized by the fact that unlike this newcomer, are accustomed to seeing people who pray in various fashions. So that unlike this newcoming person, are people who have seen people pray in a direction that is not the one that they're used to seeing. So Osama occupied the same space that the Templars took as their own, and he prayed to the south instead of to the east. But the local people, the experienced people, are used to this kind of attitude, and this newcomer was not. But I think he's doing something further, and in order to illustrate that, I turn to another story, and then we'll return to this one shortly. And this story, I bring just the second part, so I'll just fill you in on what happened before. Basically, the story go with the part of the story that is not it's not on the slide here. Relates that a certain emir stole lambs that belonged to Osama or to his family, and he was caught and accused, and in order to decide on his punishment, the king appointed a committee of knights to decide on what to do with him. And this committee of knights, this is in the perspective of Osama. He tells a story about the legal system that he sees within the Franks. They decide that this emir should compensate Osama's family in full, because not only did he steal their lambs, but they created more damage. And so we get to this, excuse me, and before that he says that only knights, okay, sorry, I'll read the rest. And so the king ordered him to pay compensation. Okay, this is the decision of the knights, the Frankish knight, that is, right? He entreated me, he being the Frankish lord who is now who was forced to compensate Osama. He entreated me and begged me to, and pleaded with me until I accepted from him 400 dinars. That is to say, I accepted from him only 400 dinars, which is to say that, excuse me?
That's a huge sum.
It's a huge sum, but it's less than he would have had to pay otherwise. And I think what is, and the next sentence also really illustrates something important about the way he sees the judicial system within the Franks, or the Frankish, the Latin kingdom. The judgment having been passed by the knights cannot be changed or rescinded by the king or any Frankish leader. So what this means is that this Frankish lord could not have turned to the king himself and asked for something that is less than the sentence that was decided upon by the knights. And only the knights could have decided that he could pay only 400 dinars. So the knight is someone of greatness in their view. The king said to yours truly, to Osama, okay, by the truth of my religion, I was made very happy indeed yesterday. And I take it to mean that yesterday is the day in which Osama made the decision that the Frank can pay him only 400 dinars. And why was he so happy? May God keep the king ever joyful. I said, what was it that led to your happiness? And the king says, they told me you were a great knight, he replied, but I hadn't really believed it. My lord, I assured him, I am a knight of my race and people. So I pause here and ask, why do you think it is important for Osama to relate this story quite in this sense? Clearly he wants to say something about his view of the Frankish legal system and of the status of knight within that system. The question is whether he wants to say something about himself as well. I think that a clue to that is in the fact that he chooses to end the story through this dialogue with the king. What would he have wanted to say about about his own disposition relative to the role of knights within the Frankish legal system in his view. What do you think? Please. That he's fairly impressive. But I think, well, so what, in what way does he, what way does he have to convey the notion that he is indeed impressive?
And so they think he must be really impressive. So it's also, so I think it is in some ways saying more about ranks and their kind of, you know, they seem kind of they're kind of very superficial level. It doesn't take much to impress them. At the same time, you know, he does get in, but you know, he's kind of big, you know, that's you know, and complimentary towards himself, but also you know, not necessarily deserving of the admiration that gets based purely on this.
Well, even if he's not deserving of it, he puts in the word of the king a very important statement. So what is it that the king says? That he's a knight. That he's a knight. So really there's and so on the face of it, the fact that he is a knight has legal repercussions. That being a knight, he is able to change the verdict in a way that the king himself wouldn't be. But I'm trying to convey through this, or what I attribute to Osama himself, is that through this dialogue with the king and his view of the Frankish legal system, what basically he is saying is that there's knights and other people being kings and leaders and maybe less important individuals, and then there's knights. But into this category, Osama himself belongs. So there's knights in this area, in this cultural sphere, in this cultural space. And the fact that some are Franks, some are Muslims, some are Syrians or Damascene, whatever their identity is of lesser importance than this notion that they belong to this category. And so now I return to this first narrative with which I began from Osama, to say the first of two conclusions that I have from this narrative. So but we began by stating that what he is attempting to do is to create a distinction between newcomers and seasoned experienced knights, locals. And what I think he's trying to do here is to say there's within this category that he defines and that he celebrates belong not only Templars who are locals and have spent a long time in the East, but he himself. We're one group, people who have been here for a long time, knights, people who are accustomed to the presence of multiplicity of religious rites, and there's others. In this case, this other is simply a Christian who came from outside, but presumably this outsider could have been from other religions. But we, people who belong to this space, are in this case both Christians and Muslims. But I think what he's doing here, in addition to that, is that the context in which he chooses to deploy this idea that he belongs to this second category, okay, is not a minor one. It is a context in which what is at stake is the question of how each of us conveys their religious commitments, so that what constitutes belonging to this second category, to which Osama also belonged, is being local and recognizing the multiplicity of ways of expressing one's commitment towards a tradition, a faithful tradition, a religious tradition, but also protecting the commitment of other people who belong to this, other people who belong to this commitment, excuse me, other people belong to this category, even if they belong to different religious traditions. And I think it's important and powerful because of what the way he begins. He curses. He doesn't spare a curse of the Franks, and he will fight them in multiple occasions. But that doesn't mean that they do not belong to the same category of people who belong here and people who perform their faith in multiple ways. Okay, so these are the first two examples, and I hurry forward to my third example. My third and fourth examples come from the Jewish Hebrew tradition, and it begins. Hurry up. Okay.
Sorry for the question.
No worries. Okay, so this the text to which I refer now has baffled scholars for a long period of time, and one version of the text to which I turn appeared in an itinerarium, a treatise that describes several circuits of pilgrimage. Several circuits of pilgrimage in the Holy Land that begins in this following paragraph. These are the boundaries of the land of Israel. The city of Akko is located on the Great Sea, on the border of the inheritance of the tribe of Asher, beyond which is outside the land, according to hitherto known tradition. The border of the land of Israel passes here. In proximity to Akko, within Shabbat limits, there is a mountain and a cemetery, both of which are inside the land of Israel. Some say the prophetess Deborah is buried there. In the city of Akko, there's a gate on the border of the land of Israel called Hasmonean Gate. Some say that Elazar Hasmonean is buried there. The cemetery that is at the bottom of Mount Carmel is the burial place of our great rabbi, Samson, son of Abraham, Tosaphist of blessed memory, and of a rabbi, son of Yechiel of Paris, also named this and that, and Jacob Bechit, son of a rabbi Samson, Tosaphist of blessed memory, and of my teacher, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman of Gerona, Nachmanid. What is baffled of several scholars is the fact that this treatise that again relates pilgrimage circuits ends with this paragraph that is I project here on show it. And it says the following: but let no one take it upon himself to say that the King Messiah will be revealed on an impure land, lest anyone make such claim. And let no one claim erroneously that the Messiah will be revealed in the land of Israel amidst the Gentiles. Whoever makes this mistake and does not rush to make this happen, that is to say, to purify the land, is disrespectful towards the King Messiah. Let it be clear, only when the land of Israel is inhabited by quote unquote bearers of the law, righteous people, men of deeds, from the four corners of the world, all of which are biblical citations, one from a city and two from a family, and all whose hearts are stirred, and in whose soul was a spirit of purity and love of holiness, then the King Messiah will be revealed among them. As it is said, I will take you one from a city and two from family and bring you to Zion. So it is not entirely clear what a passage like that, which we might interpret in a second, has to do with a treatise that is about pilgrimage or visitations to pilgrimage sites in the Holy Land. As you see in this other box to the right, or what I try to do here in this other box is to point out that a version of this very almost verbatim version of this paragraph appeared again in another text that was authored in the East in 1346 by a rabbi called Meir al-Dabi, but in a completely different context, in an encyclopedia called the Shvilei Emunah, the Paths of Faith. And this encyclopedia has 10 paths, 10 books treating various aspects of medieval Jewish natural philosophy and theology and mysticism and so on. But the 10th book, the 10th path, is devoted to the redemption, and this 10th chapter begins with this very same passage, or a version of this passage. But it so happens that this passage also appears in the middle of a much longer treatise called the Homily of the King Messiah, Magog Magog, that was authored by an anonymous disciple of a rabbi called Yitzhak ben Abraham. And this person is of importance because, in fact, he is the brother of the person, the older brother of a person named in this list of authorities that are to be found in the cemetery in Mount Carmel, namely Samson, son of Abraham. And both Samson and Isaac were the leaders of a movement of 300 rabbis who immigrated to the Holy Land from France to Jerusalem in 1211. And the author of this treatise, it is my claim, was a person who was part of this movement, made it to the Holy Lands, inhabited Jerusalem at first in 1211, and then moved with the entire French-speaking community from Jerusalem to Akko in 1217, after the raising of the walls of Jerusalem by Al-Mu'azzam in preparation of the Fifth Crusade. And this treatise, this long messianic treatise, treats various aspects of this question. For example, the timing of the arrival of the Messiah, and what will happen once they arrive. There's a whole narrative, there's a whole plot of the wars that will take place once the Messiah comes. And in the middle of this treatise, what we have again is a slightly longer version of this passage here. So before I end, does anybody have ideas of what this passage really means? What does it say about the idea of the coming of the Messiah? For those who read this, what is it? What is the expectation that will happen before the Messiah comes? Okay, can you raise your voice, please? That's that's part of the grand narrative, but that's not what this passage says.
Jews take over the Holy Land.
Well, they take over the Holy Lands. In order for that to happen, or what happens when they do that,
And the Messiah come.
it's a condition for the arrival of the Messiah. But what does taking over the Holy Land entail, according to this framing? Yeah. All right, I'm sorry. Okay. According to this framing, what does taking over the Holy Land entail? Excuse me. Going there is very important by men of deeds, which is sort of an epitome of the notion that the people who are involved in this process are pious people, but also people of practical leaning, people who actually do things. And what will they do when they come?
Conquer it.
Conquer the Holy Land, but again, the King Messiah will not be revealed on an impure land. So what is entailed in the notion that they conquer the Holy Land is that they purify it from the presumably defiled effects of the presence of non-Jews. So they have to conquer the Holy Land to either slaughter or drive away Christians and Muslims. And only when that happens, and again, what the citations, the biblical allusions refer to the notion that kind of a smaller group of people or practical people who are particularly zealous will take upon themselves this task. And when they accomplish it, only then the Messiah will come, and the next stages of the plot will ensue. I think, without going into very minute details, I think this is echoing of the ideas that one would have found in Crusade treatises, Christian Crusade treatises that call for the action of zealous participants who are called to conquer the Holy Land, to purify the Holy Land purify the holy city from the presence of Muslims, and to find this articulation in a treatise that has to do with the Messiah by somebody who participated in a movement of 300 rabbis to the Holy Land in 1211 really means to me that they're using ideas that the attribute that they recognize belong to their neighbors, to their rivaling siblings, as a way to make their ideology more efficacious. And also that this is a rhetorical strategy, because I don't believe that the person who wrote this, or the person who participated in this movement, actually perceived of their movement as one that really is a military crusade, is one that will achieve these things actually by physical force, but more as kind of a figural waging of these co-produced ideas. So I have one more example, but we'll leave it at that.
Paragraph 3, then,
Okay.
and we will, since we started a bit late, then we'll, continue until about 6:15.
If you could just leave some time for,
Yeah, so if you can take like 5 minutes, presenting the example, and then we'll leave a few minutes.
This short example comes from a completely different setting. It comes from a collection of stories, the existence of which I came to know through the generosity of Yoni Rubin, who told me about it. And it consists of 17 short tales, some of which I think came from the East. But this particular story doesn't claim to have it taken place in the East, but rather in France. And here's how it goes. This tale took place in France. Rabbi Moses said that the king of France appointed a valiant and powerful Christian, uncircumcised, tyrant, to guard that Jews do not enter the kingdom, or do not enter a particular area. Is unspecified. The king commanded that should one cross through, then local Jews should provide that crossing Jew food, drink, and lodging as much as he wanted. And then after 8 days, however, the Jew would have to fight against a Gentile, and the winner shall prevail. One day, it indeed happened that a certain feeble sage crossed through that place, for he was unaware of this decree. The Christians seized him and acted on the king's orders. And then presumably they fed him and lodged him for 8 days, but then they placed a sword in his hands and said, "Fight against this champion. If you overpower him, then you're free to go." And indeed, the Jew took the sword in his hand and stood opposite the Christian champion. And when the sage saw that the Gentile advanced towards him with the sword to kill him, he remembered the name of the Lord's sword, which was known only to a few people. And the Gentile's sword turned against his own heart, and he dropped dead on his face. And Rabbi Moses swore that this had indeed happened to the sage. And so, as I read this short narrative, I think there's at least 2 ways of approaching it. One that is a little bit more conventional and is in fact a claim that has been made, that this in a way illustrates or is an epitome of the way Jews saw themselves vis-a-vis the majority society within which they were living, that they were powerless, and that the decree was unjust, and that their only way of surviving is using their own powerlessness against their captors, against the people who were persecuting them. And in support of this this notion, we turn to the allusions, the idea of the Lord's sword, which appears in Isaiah 27, and the notion from Psalms that the wicked draw their swords, bend their bows to bring down the lowly and needy, to slaughter upright men. And in fact, the latter of these two allusions is highly important in a treatise that was a magical treatise on Jewish mysticism and magic called Moses' sword, that begins with an illustration of 4 angels who hold the quote unquote divine swords known only to few, and that is regarded as kind of a magical weapon that Jews can those who know, those who are in the know of this esoteric knowledge can use against their enemies. But I think this is in a way, this is true. This is an interpretive layer that exists in this text and is part of what makes this meaning for the readers of this. But this idea of how powerlessness, weakness, is also something that comes in line with the use of power, of force, I think exists within a much larger context and is a highly important trope in texts and treatises that speak about military monasticism and the use of religious force in a much wider context. And we could together can think of all kinds of examples. I'll just mention a trope that exists in Eastern traditions and kind of Sufi notions of what often is called renunciation through social deviance. The idea of Sufi masters whose powerlessness that is achieved through severe asceticism is what they employ in the battlefield as a way to earn the crown of martyrdom. But what happens most usually is that, in fact, they're unsuccessful in achieving martyrdom through this idea, and then it is just an emblem of their commitments. And to take a different perspective, I draw on Judith Bornstein's article on the attitude towards food within the religious, the military orders. She says that Hospitallers and Templars needed to find a balance between asceticism and their military duties. The rule of the Templars emphasized that they must not jeopardize their service to God and the defense of Christendom, stating that it was better to subject the body to many dangers than to torment it with much suffering. So the idea that there's kind of a equilibrium between asceticism and fasting and using the body as a site for conveying a commitment to the Lord is something that has a much wider trope that could be one that the author of this short narrative was aiming at in making it again more efficacious to his readers.
Thank you very much, Louis.